Mary Magdalene in the Bible comes under the classification not of whore, not of criminal, but of sinner. The only word used that makes Mary Magdalene to us look black from the gospel text is the word sinner. What is a sinner if she is female? To the church, a whore. But the Bible didn't say that. What it said was that she was a woman out of whom went 7 devils. Now, that again, it's like the 3-day rule and many things. Once we know the wording, we can determine from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other documents precisely what that meant. And suddenly, in understanding a woman out of whom went 7 devils, do I understand the word sinner, because they come hand in glove. Marys belonged to specific religious orders. Marys were bred to marry dynastic heirs. Elizabeths were bred to marry priestly dynastic heirs. Annas and Sarahs were bred to marry other dynastic heirs. And Martha's, the word Martha simply means lady, was bred to marry nobody. Marthas were wholly celibate forever. While Marys were being brought up, they were brought up under 7 opposition priests. The hierarchy at the time tested celibate females, just like the Church of Rome has its devil's advocate today, putting you to the test. These opposition priests were called demon priests. There were 7 of them. But when a woman became betrothed, the 7 demons went out. They would no longer belong to her, but the fact was, from that moment on, she was no longer a holy sister, because she was now going to get married. She was now tying herself to man, so in classification within the law, she became a sinner. Didn't mean she'd done wrong, it simply was a classification. She is now a sinner because she is not now sacred and she is not now holy, because the demons have gone. It was the demons that kept her holy. The church simply decided that a sinner who was a female had to be a whore. They knew no other way in which a woman could be a sinner, and that suited their purpose, and we'll talk quite a lot about that later on. But the fact that Mary Magdalene or anyone else of that era might have done all the things that people still do today doesn't warrant that she be put into some classification of being a criminal, even if she was taking specific drugs, because it's actually been proven that certain drugs were in very, very common use in that era by lots of people, and certainly in religious circles. So what I would like to do here is not to dispute the story, but to put it into perspective. She was not a sinner because she might have taken drugs, or because she might have taken this, or she might have taken that. She was a sinner because she was now coming out of holy office to be married. Does that do it?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Laurence.
Hello.
My comment, thank you, actually has to do with your use of the term soma, which I believe you just said was used for the living body rather than the word toma, which would have been used if Jesus' body had been dead. And just recently I was listening to a translation of the Bhagavad Gita in which I think it's Krishna speaking, and is speaking of those that knew the healing herbs, and the healing herb itself, which was as liquid moonlight, which then was referred to as soma. And a third reference was that recently Ramtha used also this term to, if my understanding is correct, to describe an ancient civilization that lived possibly 455,000 years ago, and he used that term to describe those peoples. So my question is, and I'm overhearing people saying, that's suma, that's soma, that's suma, but I feel here that there is a direct relationship between this term and all of these usages, and I wonder if you can...
Wouldn't dispute that at all. I wouldn't dispute that. I mean, there are a lot of words that have different usages that in fact in the end come to mean the same thing or the same purpose or the same use. It's like the Holy Grail itself. You can have something that has a physical aspect, have something that has a spiritual aspect. They can be the same thing. It's rather like going through the gospel stories of Jesus and talking about the miracles and making the point that these were simply unprecedented events. In doing that, it might look as if what's happening is that you're listening to somebody who's saying, well, actually, he wasn't a great healer, he wasn't a great miracle worker, whatever. There were guys like Jesus then, just like there are today, that were capable of doing astounding things, more astounding than these miracles that we see in the Bible. There are stories written down that tell us of what we might describe as illusions or magical tricks. But that didn't mean that Jesus couldn't do these things. All I'm really saying is that events in the Bible were not written to express to people events or situations or things which in those days they would have taken for granted. The fact that the Magi who taught Jesus could do feats of levitation, or that Jesus could perhaps do this or that, wasn't news. The news was the political information that was being moved around in the Gospels, and that's a different story. And so, yes, it can be said that just about anything could be physical or could be spiritual, could be practical or could be supernatural. In the end, it doesn't matter. The word used in the Gospel that was translated to the English simply referred to a body.
But a living body.
As against, well, a body as against a corpse.
I understand.
Do you see?
Yes, I particularly like stories of Jesus, born a Catholic, you know. But I revere this person, and I built my life around that until I read the word Ramtha. Jesus, especially Mary, when the announcement was made to her by an angel that she was to have such a son, where did it come from, and was that true?
Yep. And that actually,
the angel.
Well, that's something that is oddly enough, although it's slightly out of sequence, is something that I will refer to, because in dealing with the birth of Jesus' children, we can actually see what the story was relating to the birth of Jesus and what rules were broken that created the problem for Mary and Joseph. So I think probably best to tell you very shortly, I'll be dealing with that, and it will be quite close to the beginning of the second half.
Yes, I don't think he ever died.
Just be aware of one thing. We're talking here about a book that is about a bloodline, about the fact that descendant heirs pursued their inheritance and pursued the Grail message and the Grail code through history. This happened not just with the descendant heirs, it has happened throughout history to their adherents and their followers and their friends. One of the greatest musical exponents of Grail law and the Grail code was the famous German composer Richard Wagner, who composed the great Grail operas Lohengrin, Parsifal. Wagner falls into this same category. He wasn't the first of his family to be associated with the bloodline, and he was not the last. And his great-great-grandson, Adrian Wagner, has recently linked up with me to produce a new musical composition called The Holy Spirit and the Holy Grail, and he's going to release his album in conjunction with my paperback in September. So I thought, just to prove the point that even Wagners are still writing Grail music, we'll play some for you tonight. Okay, as they say, the thick plottons. We have stayed for quite a long time now in a very short period of time, 2,000 years ago, so we're going to have to speed up history and move through the next sequence more swiftly. We're going to be looking at just the last stages of the New Testament story, the ascension as linked to the resurrection. In talking about that, we're going to be discussing some aspects of marital law as applied to dynasts. We shall set the scene not only for the heirs of Jesus, but also learn a little more about the birth of Jesus himself. So, crucifixion, resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus was not an important feature of the original Gospels, nor was it of great significance to the early Christians in Rome. One can walk, as I have done, the whole meandering length of the catacombs beneath the streets of Rome to find depiction upon depiction of Jesus, his life, his ministry, their drawings on the walls. There is not one single image of the crucifixion, the resurrection, or the ascension. And these were the Christians that followed St. Peter and St. Paul in Rome. This is not surprising because of the wholly symbolic and legal nature of the resurrection. It applied to death by decree. The third day rule was brought into operation. It was positively excommunication. It was a pretty normal thing. What was surprising was that Jesus did actually find a way to be raised under those circumstances. But it wasn't a big event in their eyes. What they found important was that within a Roman imperial environment, this man had bravely led a new way of thinking, a way of thinking that dealt with equality, liberty, freedom, harmony, all the things that are just as important today. If we look at the ascension of Jesus, the ascension is described in the Acts of the Apostles, the first thing we notice is that it is not called the ascension at all. This was a name given to it later on when the Roman Church doctrines were being drawn up. What the text actually says is, and when he had spoken these things, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. It then continues a little later on, and it says, a man in white said to the disciples, why stand ye gazing up into the heavens? This same Jesus shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go. A little later in the Acts, it says, heaven must receive Jesus until the times of restitution. Restitution? Must receive? Why? What's that mean? Chronologically, the ascension, as told, can be dated precisely to AD 33 September, 6 months after the crucifixion. Isn't that the very month that Mary Magdalene was supposed to have her child? Yeah, it was. It was the law concerning Mary Magdalene's confinement that held the keys to the so-called ascension. Not only were there rules to govern the marriage ceremony of a messianic heir, there were rules to govern the marriage itself. The rules of dynastic wedlock were quite unlike the normal Jewish family norm. The parents of a messianic child were formally separated at the birth of that child. Even prior to this, intimacy between a dynastic husband and wife was allowed only in the month of December, or the equivalent, as they called it then. This was so that the births of heirs in important dynastic lines would always fall in the month of September, the month of atonement, the most holy month of the Jewish calendar. Indeed, it was this very rule which Jesus' own parents, Joseph and Mary, had broken. This was the reason why the Jews were split in opinion as to whether Jesus was in fact the true legitimate Messiah. When a dynastic child was born at the wrong time of year, the mother was placed prior to the birth in monastic custody. Simple reason, to avoid public embarrassment for having broken the rules. This was called being put away privily. And the Gospel states quite plainly that when Mary's pregnancy was discovered, Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not willing to make a public example of her, was minded to put her away privily. But in this instance, special dispensation for the birth was granted by the Archangel Simeon. who at that time held the distinction of Gabriel, being the angelic priest in charge. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Enoch, other documents detail that the archangels of the era, archangels, chief ambassadors, were the senior priests at Qumran, and they retained the traditional Old Testament titles of Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Sariel, etc. In the case of Mary Magdalene, however, her first child was properly conceived and born within the rules in September AD 33. From the moment of a dynastic birth, the parents were physically separated for 6 years if the child was a boy, and for 3 years if the child was a girl. Their marriage would only be commenced at the designated time of restitution. Jesus will return at the time of restitution. Meanwhile, the mother and child would enter the equivalent of a convent. The father would enter the kingdom of heaven. Kingdom of heaven. Mystery. Kingdom of heaven, like so many words that we use today, can have more than one meaning, but essentially based around the same thing. The word parliament is a good example. What is parliament? Is parliament the concept of the people who govern? This is the parliament? Or is it the building? The Palace of Westminster in London, that's parliament. So there are examples of the same definition being used for different things. Sometimes things had a physical dimension as well as a spiritual dimension. The kingdom of heaven was no different because the kingdom of heaven was essentially two things. It was physical, it was spiritual. But for one to exist, the other had to exist. The kingdom of heaven in its spiritual dimension is an awareness, a knowing, a consciousness. But there has to be a place of teaching. There has to be a place to develop this knowingness, a question of bringing it about. And this was done in the kingdom of heaven. So it was both things. The kingdom of heaven was the Essene High Monastery at Murd by the Dead Sea. When the Messianic dynast, on the birth of his child, was conducted to the kingdom of heaven, he was taken there by the angelic priests under the direction and supervision of the leader of the pilgrims. In the Old Testament book of Exodus, the Israelite pilgrims were led into the Holy Land by a cloud. Think of the symbolism, think of our stars and lepers and whatever. In accordance with Exodus imagery, just like the names of the angels, the scrolls tell us that Exodus imagery, Old Testament imagery, was used throughout, and the person who was called the leader of the pilgrims, who led the pilgrims, just like in Exodus, had a title, and that title was the cloud. So if we now read the Acts verses as they were intended to be understood, we see that Jesus was taken up by the cloud, the leader of the pilgrims, to the kingdom of heaven, the high monastery, the man in white, the angelic priest, so that he would return at the time of restitution when his earthly marriage was restored. It made complete sense to the people at the time. It was simply a matter of law, custom and practice, so they drew no pictures on the catacomb walls of Jesus ascending on a cloud. We can now look at St. Paul's epistle to the Hebrews, and for all of Paul's somewhat fanatical methods of teaching, and remember, Paul's fanatical methods of teaching to some extent had to be what they were in the early days. He was the first to be sent out into the imperial Roman domain. The other apostles had all taught in their homeland in Judea and Lower Samaria and Galilee and Jerusalem. They were preaching to the Jews, to their own native people. Paul was sent out into a world where there were pagan gods for every faction and every country, and these gods were born of virgins and had risen from the dead and had done so many things. So before he could get the message of Jesus across, his God had to have done all of these things and better. So the fanaticism was there. It was competition. One has to excuse Paul for that, and one sees as one progresses through his epistles and through the Acts that although the resurrection, in the way that St. Paul taught it, was very important to start with, it diminishes and it's never mentioned again for the longest time. When we read St. Paul's epistle to the Hebrews, he is talking very straightforwardly and earthly about a straightforward event, about the ascension. He defines the ascension in some greater detail, and he explains how Jesus was admitted to the monastery when he previously had no entitlement to priestly office. He tells that Jesus sprang through his father Joseph in the Davidic kingly line of Judah, a tribe that held no rights to priesthood. This was the reason why the raising of Lazarus was a miracle. It was allowed, Jesus having no rights to priesthood. These rights were the prerogative of the tribe of Levi and the descendants of Aaron, not to the house of David. And so once more in the life of Jesus at the Ascension, Paul tells us that a special dispensation was granted. He wrote that for the priesthood being changed, there was made of necessity a change also of the law. As a result of this change in the law, it is explained that Jesus was enabled to enter the priesthood, to enter the kingdom of heaven in the priestly order of Melchizedek. And so in September AD 33, the first child of Jesus and Mary Magdalene was born. There is no reference to this child being a son at that time in the gospel entry, as there is for the two subsequent births, so we know that this child was a daughter, and we have that confirmed chronologically because Jesus' next physical appearance at the time of restitution is exactly 3 years later in AD 36. We then see, by studying the chronology, that in AD 37 a second child was born, and then another in AD 44. The period between the two births to the second restitution was 6 years, denoting that the child was a son. The fact is also conveyed by the use of cryptic wording, the same cryptic wording that applied to the first son that applied to the second son. We know that there were two boys here. We also need to know this from other documents, but I'm showing you how the Gospels actually tell us the story. In accordance with the scribal codes as detailed in the Dead Sea Scrolls, everything cryptic within the Gospels is set up beforehand with some other entry. And this perpetuated into the Acts of the Apostles as well. Once the codes and allegories are understood, they never, ever vary. The same thing means the same thing every time it's used, and whenever that meaning is required, it's used every time. Messages conveying information about fertility and new life are positively established in this way for those with ears to hear by the parable of the sower whose seed bore fruit and increased. Whenever births and deaths are dealt with in the latter Gospels and the Acts following the telling of that parable, the word bore fruit and increased are used. Similarly, the Gospels explain that Jesus from the outset was called the Word of God. John tells us at great length about this. And the Word of God was made flesh, and the Word of God, he came and dwelt amongst us. Jesus increased, that is to say, he had a son. The dates that those entries come chronologically in the Acts positively conform not only to the 3 and 6 year dynastic rules to the times of restitution, they also comply with Grail-related literature coming out of the Templar environment. Probably the most misrepresented book in the whole of the New Testament is St. John's book of the Revelation. Misrepresented by the church, that is, and not by the book itself. The book is quite unlike any other in the Bible. It is dubbed with terrible supernatural overtones. Its straightforward imagery has been savagely corrupted to present the text as some form of foreboding or prophecy of warning. But the book is not called the prophecy, it is not called the warning, not called the foreboding, it is called the revelation. What does it reveal? Chronologically, the book of the Revelation precisely follows the Acts of the Apostles, and it is separated only because various epistles and letters have been put in between those two books to destroy the chronology. The book of the Revelation is in fact the continuing story of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and their sons, particularly their eldest son, Jesus, the Justice. It follows his life, it details his marriage along with the birth of his own son. The much misunderstood New Testament book is not a foreboding, it is not a warning, it isn't even a prophecy, it is a revelation. Following the first century Jewish revolt in Jerusalem, the Roman authorities, under orders from General Titus, were reputed to have destroyed all records, public and private, concerning the lineage and family of Jesus. The authority to carry out the searches and the burning came directly from the emperor in Rome in AD 70. But as confirmed by historians, particularly by Julius Africanus of Edessa, later on the destruction was far from complete. Relevant papers were retained by family members who progressed the Messianic heritage from the Holy Land into the West. Papers also, before the temple finally fell to the ground, were hidden in the vaults, and they were unearthed by the Templars some centuries later. And they backed up everything that the early historians like Africanus had said. The inheritors were called the Despacini. It simply means heirs of the Lord. It's a Greek word. For centuries, the Despacini were pursued by Roman dictate to be put to the sword by imperial command. The affairs of the Despacini are recorded by Eusebius, the 4th century bishop of Caesarea. Earlier records confirm that their persecution by Rome was formally operative right into the 3rd century. Additionally, Africanus and others stated that messianic heirs remained socially active by way of a strict dynastic progression. Indeed, by the 4th century, the Despacini were already prominent founders of the great Celtic kingdoms of Britain and Europe. Jesus, as we know, was referred to as the Christ. A Greek definition has a number of allied meanings, but in essence, Christ, Christos, King. In saying Jesus Christ, we're simply saying King Jesus. His royal heritage was of the royal house of Judah, the royal house of David, and that is mentioned numerous times in the Gospels, although rarely taught by the church. As already discussed, ordained priests were called fishers. We know that Jesus was raised to the priesthood in the high order of Melchizedek, Michael Zadok. So in this regard, Jesus also became an ordained fisher. So his legacy from that moment in time was that of a priest Christ, a fisher king. Prior to the birth of Mary Magdalene's second son in AD 44, she was exiled from Judea following a political uprising in which she was personally implicated. Along with Philip, Lazarus, and some retainers, she traveled by arrangement with King Herod Agrippa II to go and live at the Herodian estate near Lyon in Gaul, which later became France. We learn of this flight not just from great Renaissance Magdalene artwork, not just from books of European history, but from the book of the Revelation itself. There are elements of the book of Revelation which have been questioned from time to time, and the church has answers for them all. There is a particular sequence which surrounds this birth chronologically, but which somehow or other the church has applied to various people, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and others, but it makes little sense. Chronologically, it fits this moment in time. It talks about the persecution, it talks about the flight. And she, being with child, cried and pained to be delivered. And behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 7 crowns, stood before the woman for to devour her child. She brought forth a man-child, and she fled into the wilderness, and the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war forever with the remnant of her seed, which had the testimony of Jesus Christ. date of that entry AD 44, chronologically. These days, one would be quite hard-pressed, actually, to have the church admit to Mary's French exile. But we only have to go back 500 years and look at church ritual and church liturgy throughout Europe to find this story as part of what was taught and debated in just about every frontline Christian church in Europe. It was to Gaul that Mary was said to have carried the Saint Grail, the blood royal, the Holy Grail. And it was here that the famous line of Jesus and Mary's immediate descendant heirs, the Fisher Kings, flourished for 300 years. The eternal motto of the Fisher Kings was "in strength," inspired by the name of their great ancestor, Boaz, the great-grandfather of David. The name Boaz similarly meant "in strength." When translated into Latin, it became "in fortis," and this in Grail law was corrupted to "an fortas," the name of the Fisher King in Grail romance. So we can now return to the Grail's traditional symbolism as a chalice containing the blood of Jesus. We can also consider graphic designs and artwork dating well back beyond New Testament times and the Dark Ages, and we can trace it back to about 3500 BC to find that the longest standing symbol of the female was a chalice or a cup. Its representation was that of the sacred vessel, the vas uterus, the womb. And so when fleeing into France, Mary Magdalene carried the Saint Grail, the Holy Grail, the blood royal, in the sacred chalice of her womb, just as the book of the Revelation explains. And the name of this second son was Joseph. The equivalent traditional symbol of the male was a blade or a horn, usually represented by a sword or a unicorn. In the Old Testament's Song of Solomon and in the Psalms of David, the fertile unicorn is associated always with the kingly line of Judah. It was for that very reason that the Cathars of Provence and the mystic used the mystical beast to symbolize always the Grail bloodline. It was for this same reason that it became emblematic of the Grail bloodline and was used by the Desposynic House of Stuart, who took the emblem into Scotland. Mary Magdalene died in Provence in AD 63. In that very year, as a memorial to the Messianic Queen, Joseph of Arimathea built the famous chapel at Glastonbury in England. This was the first above-ground Christian church in the world. In the following year, their senior son, Jesus the Justice, dedicated this chapel to his mother. Young Jesus had been there before with Joseph of Arimathea, documented in AD 49. One often hears stories about young Jesus in England with Joseph of Arimathea. These stories actually were the inspiration for William Blake's song, Jerusalem, and did those feet in ancient time, walk upon England's mountains green. Jesus in AD 49? No, Jesus the younger in AD 49. Joseph of Arimathea was none other than Jesus Christ's own brother, James. His title had nothing whatever to do with a place name. Arimathea never, ever existed. The title was an English corruption of the Greco-Hebrew style Ramatheo, meaning divine highness, or royal highness as we would define it today. Since Jesus was the senior messianic heir, the Christ, Christos, or king, his younger brother was the crown prince, the royal highness, the Ramatheo. In the Nazarene hierarchy, the crown prince always held the patriarchal title of Joseph, whatever his baptismal name. Just as Jesus was a David and his wife had to be a Mary, the crown prince, James, was also Joseph of the Ramatheo, the high prince, the divine highness. This is why It was no surprise to Jesus' mother, Mary Magdalene, any of the women, that Jesus was to be placed in the tomb of his own brother. In the 5th century, Jesus and Mary's descendant, Fisher King Pharamond, a very famous king in French history, married Princess Argotta of the Sicambrian Franks. And from them a whole new reigning dynasty emerged, and they were the noted Merovingian kings who founded the French monarchy. They introduced into France the fleur-de-lis, the ancient Jewish symbol of circumcision, and it became the French royal emblem and remains so today. From the Merovingian succession, another strain of the family established a wholly independent, specifically Jewish kingdom in southern France, the kingdom of Septimania, the region that we now know as the Languedoc. And the early princes of Toulouse, of Aquitaine and Provence were all descended in the messianic bloodline of the Holy Grail. Septimania was granted under deed to the royal house of David in 768. Prince Bernard of Septimania later married a daughter of Emperor Charlemagne. Also, from the Fisher Kings came another important parallel line of succession in Gaul. Whereas the Merovingian succession perpetuated the patrimonial male heritage of Jesus, this other line perpetuated quite separately the matriarchal heritage of Mary Magdalene, a female line of dynastic heiresses. And they were the dynastic queens of Avalon in Burgundy, and they were the house Delac, meaning of the waters, a style granted to Mary Magdalene in the early days when she voyaged on the sea to Provence. So suddenly we're getting near to where it's at, because readers of Arthurian and Grail lore will by now have recognized the ultimate significance of this descendant family. The Fisher Kings, the Queens of Avalon, the House Delac. Prior to the Middle Ages, the individual stories of this family were historically very well known. But when the church began its reign of fanatical persecution, the Great Inquisition, the whole Nazarene and Desposenic heritage was forced underground. Why? The onset of the Inquisition. Because the High Christian Church was very suddenly embarrassed at that time by the greatest religious monuments ever to grace the skylines of the Western world. Suddenly there appeared before their eyes the great Notre Dame cathedrals of Europe. But despite their present-day image, these impressive Gothic cathedrals had nothing whatever to do with the established Christian church. They were funded and built exclusively by the Knights Templars, who in 1128 had returned from Jerusalem with a wealth of written material that had been hidden away during the 1st century, information, documented, genealogical accounts of Jesus and his family, and the true facts of the crucifixion and the resurrection. As a result, the Templars and their allied Cistercian monks under Bernard of Clairvaux challenged the church head-on. They dedicated their great cathedrals to Mary Magdalene, Notre Dame, Our Lady, whom they called the Grail of the world. And this, of course, defeated every dogma that the church had encouraged. The bishops retaliated by rededicating numerous other churches to Mary, the mother of Jesus. But even that was a problem for them. They didn't want to give her offices that they wanted to deny womanhood. They issued an edict under law that henceforth, from that moment, any depiction of Mary, the mother of Jesus, could only show her wearing blue and white. That way, she was granted no rights to any ecclesiastical office in the male-only priesthood. She could be venerated as the mother of Jesus, but that's as far as it went. In her own right, no status. Mary Magdalene, on the other hand, was being portrayed by the world's greatest artists wearing the red garb of cardinal status, or the black robes of a Nazarite high priestess, and there was absolutely nothing the church could do about it. The bishop's only option was to proclaim the whole thing heretical and sinful, because in having previously elected to ignore Mary Magdalene and her heirs, she was totally outside their immediate jurisdiction. So it was at that time that they came up with the cruncher, Grail law is now a heresy. Proclamation of the Vatican. The 6th century writings of Merlin in the 15th century were expressly banned by the Great Ecumenical Council. The original Nazarene Church was compelled to become an underground stream, aided by notable sponsors such as Leonardo da Vinci and Sandro Botticelli. In those days, the Church controlled and policed most literature in the public domain. So in order to avoid outright censorship, Grail communication, Grail literature suddenly had to move into the realms of the Gospels themselves. Messages had to be conveyed allegorically. They also had to be conveyed quite secretly outside by the use of secret watermarks and graphic symbols. Even the tarot cards originally emerged out of Grail law symbolism. But why on earth should the writings of Merlin have posed such a problem for the Church centuries later? Because within the context of Merlin's adventurous texts, just like the Grail law that preceded the edict, it and they told the descendant story of the Grail bloodline, a bloodline which had been ousted from its dynastic position by the bishops of Rome, the popes, who had elected to reign supreme by way of a totally contrived apostolic succession. The apostolic succession was said to have been handed down from the first bishop, St. Peter, and this is still the promoted view, but one only has to study the Church's own apostolic constitutions to discover that this is simply not true. Peter was never a bishop of Rome, nor ever of anywhere else. The Vatican's own constitutions record that the first bishop of Rome was Prince Linus of Britain, the son of Caractacus the Pendragon. Prince Linus was installed personally by St. Paul in AD 58 during Peter's own lifetime. From the 1100s, the powerful Knights Templars in their cathedrals posed an enormous threat to the male-only church because, once again, they brought to the fore the image of the married Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The cardinals knew that their whole establishment would tumble to the ground if the Messianic descendants, operating still, as the early historians have said, on a strict dynastic progression, were able to gain the upper hand. They had to be crushed, and so began the brutal Inquisition. The brutal Inquisitions were a direct result of the suppression of Grail law and the bloodline legacy. This Inquisition was implemented against all who dissented from the overall rule of the bishops. It all began in 1208 when Pope Innocent III sent 30,000 soldiers into the Languedoc region of southern France. This was the home of the Cathars, the pure ones, who were said to be the guardians of a great and sacred treasure, a mysterious secret that could overturn the whole of Orthodox Christianity. And the Pope's so-called crusade lasted for 36 years, during which time tens of thousands of innocent people were slaughtered in the region, but the treasure was never found. The main thrust of the Inquisition, or the Holy Office as it was called, was instituted during the course of this massacre by Pope Gregory IX in 1231. It was set against anyone who supported the Grail heresy. By 1252, the torture of victims was formally authorized along with execution by burning. The savage persecutions and punishments were openly waged for more than 400 years. Think of that in terms of American history to today. They were extended against Jews, against Muslims, against Protestant dissenters, against anybody who disagreed with the bishops of Rome. But the Inquisition was never, ever formally terminated. As recently as 1965, they decided to change its name. And it is now the Sacred Congregation. But, in theory, its powers are still in force. The descendant heirs of Jesus and Mary Magdalene posed an enormous threat to the Christian High Church because they were the true leaders still of the Nazarene church movement by then within the Celtic church structure. In real terms, the Roman Church should never have existed at all. It was no more than a hybrid movement. It was comprised of pagan doctrines, sort of attached to a fundamentally Jewish base of the early Christians in Rome. Jesus had been born in 7 BC. We know that not only from documents outside the Bible, but specifically from the 2 Bible entries that we talked about that discussed the first and second birth. 7 BC. He was 12 in AD 6 at the moment of his first year of his community life. The birthday was on the 1st of March. But in order to comply with messianic rule, he had to have an official birthday in September. Our Queen in Britain, to comply with certain dynastic rules, still has a real personal birthday and an official birthday that we celebrate. Different times of year. So, Jesus has a birthday on the 1st of March, and he has an official birthday on the 15th of September. Suddenly, in the 4th century, Emperor Constantine, in setting up the new Roman Church, doesn't like this at all. He ignores both of these dates and decides, way after the event, that the new Christ's Mass Day should be on the 25th of December, specifically so it coincided with the Roman pagan Sun Festival. Later, at the Synod of Whitby in England in 664, the bishops met again, the Great Synod. They at that time expropriated totally the traditional, long-standing Celtic festival of Easter, the goddess of spring and fertility. They gave it a whole new Christian significance. Nobody who was a Christian before 664 had ever heard of Easter being anything to do with Christianity, certainly not anything to do with crucifixions or resurrections, but from 664 it was changed. The goddess of spring was out of the door, and suddenly we have a new Christian festival. And moreover, the Celtic festival date was very close to the Jewish Passover, so they changed the date as well. So Christianity as we know it has actually evolved as a composite religion. It's actually quite unlike any other major religion today. If Jesus was the living catalyst of this religion, then Christianity should and must rightly be based on the teachings of Jesus himself. Is not Islam based on the teachings of Muhammad? But Christianity has never been based on the teachings of Jesus. Certainly not taught as a fair-minded social ministry with people as its benefactors. Christianity is based on the teachings of the church, and they are actually entirely different. There are a number of reasons for this, the first of which was that Jesus was deliberately sidestepped within the Roman Church in favour of the alternative teachings of St. Peter and St. Paul. The teachings of St. Peter and St. Paul are not only documented in the Roman Christian annals of the early years, they're also talked about at length in the Nazarene and Celtic church annals. St. James the Just himself decried them as heretics. The first person ever to claim that the Roman Church was heretical. Only by removing Jesus from the front line could the popes and the cardinals possibly reign supreme. When formally instituting Christianity as the state religion of Rome, once they decided to adopt it, Constantine actually declared that he alone, as a right from the beginning of time, was the only Saviour, Messiah of the Christian world, and Jesus was moved out of every Christian document for years. He came back when the Trinity debate began, because there was this mythical son to suddenly put in position. The only way for the Roman Church to restrain the heirs of Mary Magdalene was to discredit Mary herself and to deny her bridal relationship with Jesus. But what of Jesus' brother James? He too had heirs, as did their other brothers, Simon, Joseph, and Jude. And I've had so many people say to me, where on earth do these brothers come from? They come from the Gospels and every other document. They're listed, they're mentioned, they're talked about. Yes, he had brothers, and the Gospels specifically refer to Mary just about every time when they're talking of Jesus as Jesus being Mary's firstborn son. Anyway, Mary's motherhood itself had to be repressed. She was a virgin, Mary Magdalene was a whore. Neither of these descriptions was mentioned in the Gospel, but there was actually another problem, because if Mary was a virgin, then she couldn't have actually been quite normal either. So we have to actually sort her out. So we've knocked Joseph out of the picture, but what about Mary's documented father? We'll cross him out of the Gospels. In fact, we'll actually cross her mother out of the Gospels as well. And this didn't happen until very late in time. And then quite suddenly, only a couple of hundred years ago, they thought of the idea. 200 years ago, roughly. Mary was herself born by Immaculate Conception. Great, got it. So the Pope said this, and the Pope is infallible, and that's it. No way out. She's born of Immaculate Conception, she's a virgin, and that really cements the whole thing. Mary Magdalene, she's a whore, she's out of the window. Heirs? Can't be heirs. So that was it. And over the course of time, you know, I mean, these doctrines, contrived doctrines, have had an enormously widespread effect. In the early days, it was much more difficult to sort of cement the ideas in people's minds, because they actually knew the truth. They still were reading documents that told them the original story. The original women of the Nazarene mission had a significant following in the Celtic Church for ages. Women such as Mary Magdalene, as Martha, as Mary Jacob Cleopas, and Helena Salome, and Joanna, and others, had disciples that ran on for centuries the same schools that were founded by these women in the first century. They had run social missions throughout the Mediterranean world, and these schools still existed. These women had all been disciples of Jesus. They had been close friends of Mother Mary, and they had actually accompanied her to the crucifixion, as the Gospels tell us. The Church's only salvation really was to deny women altogether, to deny them not only rights to ecclesiastical office, but to deny them rights to any status in society according to church doctrine and church law. Hence, the church actually formally decreed in the 17th century, and we're moving on in time now, that all women are heretics and sorceresses. Interesting new one, that. Sorceresses. Very interesting that that edict ties in precisely with the beginnings of the great witch hunts that went on for 250 years. And the very strange trials and testing that went along with witch hunting. We have to throw you into the water, I'm afraid. If you drown, it proves that you weren't a witch. That's fine. If you don't drown, it proves that you are, so we'll burn you. The witch hunt records actually, in the end, accommodated men and were actually used to sort of circumvent political trials, because they got round the law. You could execute people on the spot. But essentially, when you look at the early dictates to the so-called witch-finder generals in the field, they were designed strictly against women, because only women could really be sorceresses, and if men were caught up into it and finally had to be persecuted and executed, that was only because they'd fallen victim to the sorcery of women. And in this, the church bishops were aided by the words of Peter and Paul, and on the basis of their teachings, the church was enabled to become wholly sexist. In his epistle to Timothy, Paul had written, "I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp any authority over the man, but to be in silence." Tried saying that to my wife. Doesn't work. In the Gospel of Philip, Peter is recorded as saying, women are not worthy of life. But Rome came up with a great one. They rewrote the Last Supper in an official document and contrived a conversation between the apostles that was never mentioned in any gospel. Hundreds and hundreds of years later, they wrote that there was a conversation. And the conversation was, why is it that Mary Magdalene isn't mentioned in the Last Supper? Wouldn't she have been there? Well, says Martha, she was actually, but Jesus saw her laugh and he threw her out because she wasn't serious. So women are not only sorceresses, they're silly. The church father Tertullian summed up the whole Roman attitude, writing about the emergent disciples of Mary Magdalene specifically. These heretical women, how dare they? They are brazen enough to teach, to engage in argument, to baptize. It is not permitted for a woman to speak in church, nor to claim any masculine function, least of all in priestly office. This sexist attitude has persisted within the church to the present day. Why? Because Mary Magdalene had to be discredited and specifically moved from the reckoning so that her heirs could strategically be ignored. Now things are changing. Not only in respect of books like mine, but women are actually now being restored to the priestly station in the Anglican Church. And Rome are looking very concerned. Notwithstanding the avid sexist movement, the Messianic heirs retained their social positions outside of the church establishment. They progressed their own Nazarene and Celtic movements, and they founded despotic kingdoms in Britain and across Europe, and they continued to be a high threat to the great church and the figurehead monarchs and governments empowered by that church. They were the very reason for the implementation of the brutal Inquisition, because they upheld a moral and social code which was quite contrary to church requirement. This was especially apparent during the age of chivalry, which embraced a respect for womanhood. And this was exemplified by the early Knights Templars, whose constitutional oath supported the veneration for the great Grail Mother, Queen Mary Magdalene. Undaunted by the Inquisition, the Nazarene movement pursued its own course, and the story of the Bloodline was perpetuated in literature, romantic literature now, such as the Grand St. Grail, the high history of the Holy Grail. And these writings were largely sponsored by the Grail courts of France themselves, the courts of Champagne, Anjou, and others, and also by the Knights Templars and directly by the despotic houses. And it was at that stage that Arthurian romance suddenly emerged in the late Middle Ages as a popular vehicle for the Grail tradition. In the light of this, the Templars themselves became a specific target of the Inquisition in 1307, when the armies of Clement V, the Pope, and King Philip IV of France were set in their direction. Not only had the knights returned from the Holy Land with important first-century documentation, but they had also returned with incredible wealth and treasure. They were not only in a position to dismantle the church structure with their knowledge, but the order was financially far richer than the Vatican itself, and therefore posed a significant threat. In fact, the Knights Templars at that stage were the richest single order that the world has ever known, and the whole of our international banking network that we all use today and our clearing houses was all established by the Knights Templars in that era, when they funded every European court. The papal armies scoured Europe for the Templar documents and the treasure, but like the other Cathar inheritance, nothing was found. Many knights were tortured, executed in the process, and their companions were banished to regions outside the papal domain. But the Templar hoard, although not found, was never lost. Its day-by-day existence is recorded, and all the time they were searching for it in southern France, it was locked away in the treasury vaults of Paris. One night it was loaded onto 18 galleys at the port of La Rochelle, and the fleet set sail for Scotland. There the Templars were welcomed by King Robert the Bruce, along with the whole Scottish nation. He'd been already excommunicated by the Pope anyway, so he could quite easily receive the Templars. He had actually dared to disagree with the King of England, who was a Catholic, so he was excommunicated. But so were every single Scottish person. That was not lifted for a long, long time. In fact, the people forgot it happened in the first place. It wasn't until it was reinstated that they thought, oh yes, we're excommunicated. We didn't know that. So it wasn't important. The Templars and their treasure from that moment in time, apart from an offshoot order in Portugal, remained in Scotland. The Templar treasure today remains in Scotland. The knights fought with Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314 to regain Scotland's independence from Plantagenet England. But going back to the early story, why was King Arthur so important? How was it that suddenly King Arthur and his knights became a vehicle for telling the Grail story? Because Arthur was absolutely unique in a particular stage of the bloodline heritage. He had a dual heritage in the Messianic line. King Arthur was by no means mythical, as so many have supposed and surmised, but he has always, it seems, been looked for in the wrong places, because people who search for King Arthur are misguided by the locations in the fictional romances. They have searched in vain through the chronicles of Brittany and Wales and the west of England, and Arthur is nowhere to be found. Arthur's battles are not found in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles of England, and yet they've been specifically named and dated in Grail lore. Are they to be found? Yes, they are all there if you look in the right place. King Arthur is detailed in the Irish and Scots chronicles. He was indeed the High King of the Celtic Isle, and he was the sovereign commander of all of the Celtic British troops in the late 6th century. Arthur was born in 559 and he died in battle in 603, and his mother was Igerna Dillac, the daughter of Queen Viviane of Avalon, in direct descent in the female matriarchal line from Mary Magdalene. His father was High King Aidan of Dalriada, the Western Highlands of Scotland, which are now called Argyll. And Aidan, at that time, was the British Pendragon, the head dragon, the King of Kings, in a direct Nazarene descent from Jesus' brother James. So King Arthur was special. He was not the last, but the first to be born out of a union between the line from Jesus and from his brother James. The chronicles and records of Scotland's kings, moving on into the centuries, even in the 9th century when King Kenneth MacAlpin united the Picts and Scots under one kingdom, when one reads through the constitutions and the records of the coronation of kings like him, the House of Avalon is distinctly and specifically mentioned as being the ultimate Celtic right to kingship in Scotland, and the House of Avalon was the matriarchal descent from Mary Magdalene. King Aidan's paternal legacy emerged through the most ancient of Britain's royal houses. Again, not mythical or fictional, the House of Camelot. This was England's royal court of Colchester, and it was reigned in a line from the first Pendragon of Britain, King Cymbeline, who is well known, of course, to students of Shakespeare. Camelot was the name for the Iron Age fortress at Colchester. Camelot was the Celtic word for bent light. By that time, Messianic descendants had founded despotic kingdoms in Wales and across the Strathclyde and the Cambrian and the northern regions of Britain. Arthur's father, King Aidan of Scots, was the first British monarch ever to be installed by priestly ordination when he was crowned and anointed by St. Columba of the Celtic Church in 574. From that moment of coronation, the kindred of St. Columba has been the royal ecclesiastical seat of the kings of Scots. And it's that kindred that I'm the Grand Prior of today. This, of course, infuriated the Roman bishops. Gosh, a king in Britain crowned by a Celtic priest, this is not on. Only the Pope has the right to appoint kings and to crown them. We'll have to do something about this. What shall we do? We'll send St. Augustine over to dismantle the Celtic Church. And so in 597, St. Augustine came from Rome to dismantle the Celtic Church. He proclaimed himself Archbishop of Canterbury and allied himself at the time with the Queen of the king who was ruling from Kent, who was already a strongly bred Catholic. But overall, Augustine's mission failed. He managed to retrain parts of Lower England so that England suddenly became a Catholic nation in many respects under the Archbishopric of Canterbury. But in Wales, in Cornwall, in Ireland and across the breadth of northern England and Scotland, this never happened, and the Celtic Church prevails. And even the Church today has no concept of what the truth of this was that Augustine was sent over to do. It's no secret, it's in the books. But this is the great anniversary of the year that Augustine came over. Why did he come over in that year? In 597, 1400 years ago? Very conveniently, because he came over just a few weeks after St. Columba of the Celtic Church had died. So, with the great leader of the Celtic Church movement over the way, Augustine was sent. Suddenly there was no leader. Become the new leader. Turn it into Catholicism. And what on earth happens today? A few weeks ago, 1400 years after the event, but the Church of England decides to have the great cross-country pilgrimage of St. Columba and St. Augustine, the two brother saints of the Christian Church. Not so. There were never more hated enemies. Even the post office has issued stamps with their joint pictures on, as if they were brothers. And St. Columba had nothing whatever to do with the Roman Christian Church. He was head of the Celtic Church. He was head of the Nazarene movement. He was head of the church that supported the Grail bloodline that was fronted by the Desposini. And in fact, St. Columba's own heritage came through a very separate line from the royal house of David, which had moved into Ireland sometime before. An important fact to remember about Grail dynasts is that they were never, ever, when in operation, territorial governors of lands. Like Jesus himself, they were designated guardians of the people. The Merovingians of Gaul, for example, were kings of the Franks. They were never kings of France. Robert the Bruce, the Stuarts, the successors, were kings of Scots, never kings of Scotland. And it was this implicitly social concept which the High Church found so difficult to overcome, for the bishops preferred to have dominion over territorial kings, while the people's senior lord and master was supposed to be the Pope. Only by maintaining ultimate spiritual control over individuals could the Church reign supreme. And so whenever a Grail dynast actually came to the fore and began to gain some prominence, he was met by the wrath of this great papal machine. Back in 1751, the bishops actually managed to depose the Merovingian succession in Gaul. And at that time, they established a wholly new tradition whereby kings of the Carolingian succession, the House of Charlemagne, had to be approved and crowned by the Pope. And from that moment, it became the tradition. But the Church could never, ever topple the Desposinic kingdoms of England and the rest of Britain. Parts of England have been dismantled by Germanic Anglo-Saxons by force of arms, but the Church never actually managed to dismantle it, certainly not in Scotland in the longer field of time. Even by the Middle Ages, long after the Norman conquest of Britain, the Nazarene Church and the cult of Mary Magdalene, this was a big cult, for want of a misused word today. The following of Mary Magdalene, right up to the 15th and 16th century, was enormous in Britain and Europe. Women's rights of equality at that time, as recorded, were still predominant within the Celtic church structure. The Nazarene rules were still obeyed. There were women high priestesses, and the church hated it. The underlying principle of the Grail monarchs was always one of service, and we get back now to the Messianic code established by Jesus. The true Grail dynasts were kings. They were guardians of their realms. They never ever ruled. This key aspect of the Grail code was perpetuated at the very heart of nursery tale and folklore. Never ever in any story that you have ever read did a valiant cardinal or bishop rush to the aid of a damsel in distress. Or an oppressed subject. This has always been the realm of the Grail princes and their appointed knights. The Grail code recognizes advancement by merit. It acknowledges community structure, but its rule is entirely democratic. So whether apprehended in its physical or its spiritual dimension, the Grail belongs to leaders and followers alike. It belongs also to the land, it belongs to the environment, and it requires that all should be as one in a common, unified service. Throughout the ages, parliaments and governments have had as much trouble as the church in confronting this messianic social code. The position is no different today. Presidents and prime ministers are elected by the people. They are supposed to represent the people. Do they? In actual fact, they don't and they can't, because presidents and prime ministers are always affiliated to a political party. They achieve their positions by way of majority party vote. When it comes to wider scale elections in the bigger domain, not everybody takes the trouble to vote. Sometimes there are more than two parties to vote for at any given time, as now, here and back in England and Britain. More than half the people of the country are not represented by the political party in power. So in this regard, whether they're good or bad at their government, even though the majority vote principle has sort of been applied but not worked, the democratic principle itself fails, because there are more people that did not vote for you than did. So what emerges, as we said right back at the beginning, is that we see not government by people for the people, but simply government of the people. Now, Jesus confronted a very, very similar situation to this way back in the first century. At that time, Jerusalem and Judea were under Roman occupation. King Herod, the governor Pontius Pilate were both appointed by Rome. But who represented the people? The people were not Romans. They were Holy Land Jews, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes and the like. Apart from that, there were large numbers of Samaritans and Gentiles, the non-Jews. Who on earth represented all these people? The answer actually is no one, until Jesus made it his social mission to do so. This was the beginning of the non-affiliated code of princely service, a code perpetuated to this day by messianic dynasts in their continuing role as common fathers to the people. The Grail Code is based on the principles of liberty, fraternity, and equality. It was particularly apparent in the American and French revolutions, both of which discarded the lordship of despotic kingship and aristocracy. But what's replaced these things? They have been replaced by party politics and largely non-representative government. America truly has an enviable written constitution. But who actually, in the event, champions this constitution on behalf of the people? Certainly not the Supreme Court, as some politicians have tried to tell me, because although the court can challenge Congress and can mediate in federal cases, it is ultimately concerned with upholding the law of constitutional principle, not with promoting social justice. The court also holds the right to interpret the Constitution. To interpret? Doesn't it say what it means? But the Chief Justice and the 8 justices of the Supreme Court They're appointed by the president. So their interpretations, when they make them, are of necessity politically influenced. Among the truly great dynasties, long-reigning dynasties of the Messianic line, was Britain's own royal house of Stuart. Like King Arthur, this succession was special, and this was the second time in history that it was really special because they had a dual Messianic descent. They descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene by way of the Merovingian Fisher kings, and from Jesus' brother James by way of Arthur's own father, Aidan the Pendragon. Of kings of Scots from 1371, the Stuarts became Europe's historically longest ever reigning house. In their early years, they founded numerous state-funded hospitals. They founded colleges, universities. They introduced, back in the 1400s, the first minimum wage scales in Europe. But from 1603, they fell victim to a plot by the English politicians who had long sought to gain control in Scotland. At that time, the Scottish crowns were united. But just 85 years later, after all of this happy reign in Scotland, the Stuart dynasty was deposed and sent into exile. Why? Because they claimed affinity to God and the nation before Parliament, the Church, and the English aristocracy. In 1687, the Stuart king, James VII, had issued a lengthy declaration for liberty of conscience. This declaration by the king proclaimed that every citizen in the realm, whether Protestant, Catholic, Jew, Quaker, or whatever, had the right within that realm to worship openly according to conscience. And for this alone, James was persecuted and deposed by the English church aristocracy, who attested that people have no such right of individual choice. Various acts of parliament were then put into place in Britain so that future monarchs could exist only by consent of the government and the Anglican Church. They were rendered virtually powerless, as they remain today, because the acts are still in force. Subsequently, the German Elector of Hanover was installed as King George I, and this was a brilliant move because the politicians knew this would be good for them, because King George, who reigned for 13 years, could not and never could speak or write a word of English. Apart from about 10 months in that 13 years, he spent all of his time in Germany. So the result of all this is that in Britain today we have Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Quakers, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, you name it. We have them all, but the Parliament is strictly Anglican and the monarch is the head of the Church of England. Now this strictly strategic form of denominational hierarchy is contrary to all the precepts of the Grail Code. It leaves the majority spiritually unrepresented by those in control. In such a constrained environment, enthusiasms necessarily fail. Ambitions are restricted because people are not at one with their governing establishment. Hence, the social ethic that binds a nation together towards any common goal is completely lost. Community flounders in a state of uncertainty. Without the advantage of a written constitution, Britain's monarchy is a parliamentary monarchy, not a constitutional monarchy as in other European countries. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, good examples of constitutional monarchies. A great example of a constitutional monarch acting on the people's right occurred very recently in Belgium. King Albert spoke out publicly during the scandal of the paedophile network. He announced that certain high-level officials were actually involved with the ring. The government press in Britain and Europe immediately retaliated, saying that he should keep his opinions to himself, at which over 300,000 people took to the streets of Brussels to support their king. As a result of that, numerous judges, police chiefs, and politicians were sacked, disgraced, and criminally charged because King Albert, acting on behalf of his people, was correct. Throughout the Stuart era, the American people had been quite content as residents of British colonies. But the emergent despotism of the Hanoverian Parliament was certainly too much to bear. In 1775 began the War of Independence. 8 years later, freedom for the United States was declared at the Treaty of Paris. A constitution was then drawn up by the American fathers to be enacted in 1789. The original model for this constitution was actually Scotland's own 1320 Declaration of Arbroath, the very written constitution of Robert the Bruce that was being denied to the Scots people in their own homeland. America's constitution was based on other things too. It was based on Indian rights of law, which themselves had derived from aspects of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. These were upheld by the Jacobite Royal Society, to which, as I mentioned earlier, eminent Americans such as George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and others were all attached. George Washington actually had a personal line of ancestry direct from the Royal House of Stuart. In Britain, the Stuart Society and the Royal Society within included Grail champions such as Isaac Newton, Samuel Pepys, Christopher Wren, Robert Boyle, Francis Bacon, and many other leading Rosicrucians. And these men were the greatest of all Britain's scientists, doctors, philosophers, architects. The church, one by one, pronounced them all heretics. In establishing the new republic, the American fathers decided that actually it would be wise to appoint a constitutional monarch. Someone to be a guardian of the realm, somebody who could actually operate quite independently of party politics. This way the Constitution could be upheld and protected by its own champion on behalf of the people. So to whom did they turn? In November 1782, George Washington sent a 4-man delegation to the San Clement Palace in Florence. On their arrival, Washington's envoys sought an audience immediately with none other than Charles III Stuart, better known to us all perhaps as Bonnie Prince Charlie. They offered him, at that time, the crown of the Americans, and in 5 family records and in the records of everyone that was there in the US State Archives, the conversation is recorded like a script, person by person. Only 36 years before, Prince Charlie had failed to regain the crown of Scots from the Germanic rulers in Britain. But when the Scots families had emigrated from their own country in tens of thousands after the Battle of Culloden, a great many found their way to America. Today, there are more Scots in Los Angeles, New York City, and North Carolina alone than there are in the whole of Scotland. These Jacobite families not only fled to North America in the 18th century, but they were largely instrumental in promoting the concept of American independence. They had not managed to defeat the Germanic House of Hanover at home, but here was another chance. They helped, and this time the campaign was successful. At the time of George Washington's invitation, Prince Charles Edward had applied to the Pope for a divorce. He had no legitimate heir. He was no idea what his future was going to be. He declined the offer, and what he says is, if I die without an heir, then because I am the de jure King, Prince of Britain, the House of Hanover could automatically reclaim America back when I die. As it transpired, he married again 3 years later at the Church of the Apostles in Rome, and he fathered a legitimate son in 1786, so the Stuart line was itself preserved. Nonetheless, the Westminster Parliament got a hold of this and veiled the whole succession in Britain by producing fraudulent translations of wills. They couldn't disguise the issue in Europe, because in Europe the family records were perpetuated truthfully in the papers, and the registrars today hold all the documentary evidence, births, deaths and marriages and the like of that family from that date. The legitimate Stuart succession now rests with Prince Michael Stuart, the 7th Count of Albany, who is president of the European Council of Princes and is the guy that very kindly wrote the foreword in my book. And next spring, his own book, Scotland, the Forgotten Kingdom, is scheduled for publication by the same publisher, by Element Books, and that is a must for any Scots here or people interested, because, boy, that is enlightening about what really happened in English and Scottish history. So tonight we've had a bit of an overview of Bloodline of the Holy Grail, and the book, Century by Century, takes us through the story of a resolute royal dynasty, the descendant heirs of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, who've struggled against all odds through the years to preserve the Messianic Grail Code. Within the book there are no less than 46 genealogical charts detailing the various lines of descent, generation by generation. But why has this information been suppressed for so long? Why is it coming to light now, today? The short answer to this, as we've seen, is that the information has been suppressed by power seekers who seek to serve their own ends rather than serving the communities they are supposed to represent, whether we be talking about churches or governments. Some things are not easy to suppress in the short term, but the easiest way to suppress something in the long term is to promote something else in its stead from a very vigorous power base. These days we call it market force advertising. Also, to persecute and execute champions of the truth. That's a good move, because that gets rid of them. And in the course of time, what happens is that the original facts are forgotten and actually no longer taught. But today we're in a wholly new age of questing, and you people are more expert at this than even I. Many people have grown so disillusioned with the establishment dogmas that prevail, but they know up here and in here that there is actually something better and more important to believe in. We live now in an age of satellite communications, sound barrier travel, computers, the internet, you name it. And in such an environment as this, news travels so quickly that the truth is almost impossible to restrain. And so the very fabric of the male-dominated church and its governmental structures are now being questioned by any intelligent person. It's generally perceived, and it's blatantly obvious, that the old doctrines of spiritual control and territorial management just do not work. Actually, we've given them a few centuries. That's long enough. Let's try something else, and people are saying this openly now. More and more people are searching for the original, uncluttered roots of their faith. They're looking for their true purpose for themselves and for society as a whole. They're looking for a more effective forms of administration to combat the all too apparent slide that we're seeing into a general social and moral decline. What they're questing for is the Holy Grail. The quest for new enlightenment is considerably heightened now as we approach the new millennium. There's a widespread feeling that this millennium gives us a baseline on which to perhaps pin a new renaissance. An era wherein the precepts of the Grail Code can perhaps be practiced and acknowledged, the precepts of proper liberty, fraternity and equality. Because the word renaissance means rebirth. The word rebirth means resurrection. But there's an ordinance which governs this resurrection, and it's governed this resurrection for the last 2,000 years, and Grail law has said it loud and clear for centuries. Only when the wound of the Fisher King is healed will the wasteland return to fertility. That is the only time, it tells us, when we can really expect the true spirit of the Sang Grail to return. Well, I'll finish the formal talk there and have a few more questions, because I've missed out a lot historically. It's all in the book, and you'll find it when and if you read the book. But if there's anything obvious that springs to mind, now I'll take questions. Before I do that, I will make an announcement. There has come to my attention that a large number of the American edition of Bloodline of the Holy Grail has a page missing. Nobody knows how it is even possible, because it is produced from the same computer disk that every other edition came from. But page 274 refers you to the chart on page 274. And page 273 has nothing on it at all. There is a chart missing on page 274. Greg Simmons has a copy of that chart, and they will be made available to anybody that wants copies of that chart through the bookshop. I can only apologize for elements.
Thank you for coming. I'd like to honour you this evening for your magnificent talk. I read a book called Holy Grail across the Atlantic, and it talks about an island off Nova Scotia called Oak Island, and the possibility of a lot of artefacts being buried there that they're having a lot of difficulty digging up. Do you know anything about this?
I didn't just hear the last bit. They had difficulty digging up?
A lot of artefacts. What happens is
Right.
this
This is-
burial site.
This is Bradley's book, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting book. In fact, in the appendix to my book, I have an appendix chapter that actually touches on this subject. Bradley writes at much greater length, and I have referred to his book, among others, for people to look at in this respect. It actually comes from the truth of the matter concerning the real findings against founding of America. Because we all know that Christopher Columbus found America. However, as Bradley and other writers report, and in fact as I can back up, because this is wholly Scottish information, America was being sailed to, and certainly northern parts of Canada, Nova Scotia, were being sailed to from the Orkney Islands and Scotland and parts of Norway from the 700s. America was not discovered in 1400 odd by Christopher Columbus. There are maps dated around 900 AD that actually show the Canadian and parts of the North American coast in great detail. The Sinclair family of Scotland, who Bradley mentions in particular, sent a great fleet across to the Americas about 150 years or so before Columbus went. And as a result of their sailing, German cartographers actually produced the first globe of the world, a globe. And this was really what cemented it for Columbus, because Columbus's story is an odd one that isn't actually questioned by too many people. But Columbus went on this journey funded by Ferdinand and Isabella, the King and Queen of Spain. At that time, Ferdinand II was actually classified as the Catholic. He was the implementer and overlord of the Great Inquisition at that time, and he was the ultimate promoter of the fact that the earth was flat. Columbus received no monetary grant from the King of Spain. Columbus's money came from a knightly order fronted by Leonardo da Vinci. What happened was that he appeared at the court of the King and Queen of Spain with this globe. And what had happened was that the King and Queen of Spain knew that the King of Portugal had actually sent a man off to discover this place over there. And so Ferdinand had a problem. He could hardly agree with the fact that there might be something out there, but on the other hand, he didn't want to be beaten to something by the King of Portugal, so he simply said to Columbus, okay, if you can find the money, you can go, and we'll give you some ships to go in. So they provided ships, and Columbus went, and Columbus came back, and we know the rest of the story. But yes, as you say, there are artifacts in Nova Scotia. There are above-ground artifacts in parts of America and Canada. There are cannons on, I forget which island, one of the islands off the Canadian coast. There are cannons that are Viennese cannons that date back to the 11th century, left there in the 11th century by Venetian sailors. There are Templar carvings in a Templar burial ground in Massachusetts, with family emblem that dates from the 1300s, still 150 years before Columbus ever went there. So yes, we know that Bradley's book is a great book, well worth reading, goes much deeper into it, but there are artifacts, there are buildings. There is a Templar round tower also at Rhode Island, Newport. on Rhode Island. So the Columbus story is a good one. I mention it in the book, but Bradley's does a much better job. Thank you. Next one.
I want to thank you for coming. I found your talk very fascinating. It's really very interesting. But I'm also interested in knowing how you could determine some of these dates that you allude to. I can see how some of them logically you can arrive at, but like the dates regarding King Arthur. So many historians don't seem to have any idea, and I know you said that they were looking in the wrong places, but do you have documentation, or how do you arrive at some of these dates?
I don't arrive at them. I simply look at the documentation that has them. The Chronicles of the Scots, the Chronicles of Dalriada, the Annals of the Picts, the Annals of Munster, of Leinster in Ireland, the Annals of Connaught in Ireland, all detail King Arthur and the battles that he fought in. His coronation is mentioned specifically in the Scottish Annals. His date of birth and his age at coronation is recorded in the Scottish Annals, and his date of birth and the battle that he died in is recorded in the Scottish and Irish Annals. So it's really not a question of determining something by route of deduction. It's simply a question of finding the document that gives you the information. On top of that, Celtic church records are an enormous help. As I've said, I have access to Celtic church records that have never been published, and probably they won't in full apart from bit by bit through books like mine. The Celtic church records are actually quite stunning when it comes to King Arthur, and these are first-hand accounts written by the monks of the church in the late 500s. They tell the story, the root of the story, that Tennyson much later converted into Lancelot's affair with Guinevere, the story that sort of lost the crown and the kingdoms and sent everybody off in search of the Holy Grail. This was a tremendous story because the Celtic church reported it in full in their records. Lancelot de Lac, remember the House de Lac? Lancelot de Lac was specifically sent over by his mother with the Sword of Avalon to grant personally on behalf of the Burgundian house to Modred, the son of Arthur and Morgane de Lac. Modred in that very year was proclaimed archpriest and Celtic Christ of the Celtic Church. And Lancelot was supposed to present this sword to him, but instead he gave it to Arthur, Modred's father. Now, we now move into realms which may be called symbolic or mythical, but what happened was that from that moment, Arthur began to lose all his battles. The Anglo-Saxon advance surged forward across England, and ultimately the Anglo-Saxon conquest was over. And the whole of Scotland and the Celtic Church blamed Arthur for accepting this sword of Avalon and for destroying his pledge of allegiance to the Celtic Church and laying the land to waste. And this was turned into a romantic affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, and the historical symbolism was lost. But even to such detail as those little bits of story are Arthur's story told in first-hand annals of the time, let alone what people might have written about him in some fanciful romance 1,000 years later. So not difficult to find really these dates at all. Everything's recorded. I mean, it's what one talks about the crucifixion, for example, and says, you know, everybody's been arguing for years about, was it this date or was it that date, and did he die when he was 30, and was it AD 30 or whatever? For goodness sake, it's in the annals of Imperial Rome. You simply have to look up the records. Oh yes, this man was sent and tried before Pontius Pilate and sentenced along with other people to crucifixion, date AD 33. So not difficult. You know, a lot of people write books and perpetuate the myth that there is a great mystery to discovering a lot of this stuff, and that you've got to be Hercule Poirot or some great detective to get to the root of it. Not so. You just have to persist with records.
Thank you very much. I had one more question. You mentioned that there was a new book out on Scottish and English history. Mm-hmm. Could you give us the title of that again?
It's called, in fact, I will give you the title again because I give a title in my book towards the end when I announce it's coming. But the title that I give has become simply a working title, and it now has a new title. It's to be released by Element Books in April of next year, which is precisely a year away, and it is called Scotland, the Forgotten Kingdom by Prince Michael Stewart of Albany.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To me, it seems that there has to be a bigger picture. And I was wondering if you confronted that bigger picture in your research.
A bigger picture in relation
Meaning
to...
that Jesus came from the line of David.
Yeah.
Okay, now what was the line of David all about? And Jesus was confronting...
Okay, yep, got it. Bigger picture, yes. Follow on from what I said to the previous gentleman, something much bigger he had to have been a vehicle for.
Right.
However, something much bigger existed also in terms of the bloodline itself. And whereas the picture that I turned into my triangle from Jesus to the present day does that, my next book begins in 5000 BC and goes through, even from that point in time, it starts with 12 family lines. In fact, a couple of thousand years before Adam, family lines, generations, marriages, coming down to that point. That book will be called, I think, something like Birth of the Grail Bloodline, and we're hoping to launch it for the millennium. So that's where the bigger picture will emerge, yes. A big, big story. The great royal houses of Egypt, Sumer, ancient Mesopotamia, all come from something much bigger in the beginning.
Okay, the next question is that you mentioned something about the structure of this government, and that how that the Supreme Court can't exactly disagree or say exactly how they feel because of the Constitution. Do you believe that the Constitution was formed in the interest of the people, the United States Constitution?
Mm. Well, I mean, the first part of the question is that the Supreme Court actually has ultimate powers, and one can see why in a federal situation like this, that somebody, some group has to have some sort of powers of mediation. It's a bit like calling in the FBI because this is an interstate matter, you know, and it's not just the local sheriff here and the local police force there. Somebody's moving around, and somebody on more of a federal basis has got to be part of this. And the Supreme Court can do that. It can actually mediate in federal cases. It can sort out disputes between legislatures of different states. And so in that respect, what I really can say is that it operates on behalf of the Constitution, but it doesn't acknowledge the fact that the Constitution exists on behalf of the people. What it seems to perpetuate is the myth that the Constitution exists by right of the law. So it perpetuates the rule of law, not the rule of social justice.
Exactly.
Do I think it was constructed with the people in mind? Absolutely. I think, and I've studied constitutions a lot, particularly the American Constitution, because I worked with these American lawyers on it for months and months and months, producing this concordance that was never published anywhere, apart from being available in England in a sort of bound form. The American Constitution, believe me, is brilliant. Brilliant. But it has more amendments than Constitution.
Well, my belief is that the reason it has amendments is because the very reason it was made wasn't necessarily what it's purported to do.
It was designed, for exactly the reason that I stated, to have an appointed guardian of its own. But it never got that second part.
Well,
the Constitution existed in a brilliant form. In fact, I mean, if one compares, as I've done before the days of computer expertise, side by side in a line, every one of the world's written constitutions, whether it's Europe's, Australia's, Canada's, or whatever, and put America's in there, in actual fact, America's allows for generally a greater freedom of access for people, because in essence, its rulings were more liberal and not so well defined as those of other countries. Now, where it falls down is because of these lack of refinements and definitions, in that from time to time somebody actually does have to come along and say, we have to interpret this. Yes, the Constitution says I can bear arms, but does that actually mean I can go around shooting people? Gosh, what does the Constitution say? It doesn't say. We have to define this. We have to have an amendment. We have to have an addition. But the problem is that legally, what's happened, and this was what I got involved in, is that with the right to interpret the Constitution, the court can at any time only take into account, if it wants, one aspect of what the Constitution says about that particular subject that's under debate. And it can rule on that aspect. It may know of, but doesn't have to take into account 13 other entries on the same related subject, which might actually turn the whole thing upside down.
Hi, you said that you did genealogical research. You were commissioned by 33 families. Is that correct?
Not separately on one specific day, but over a period of time.
Over a period
I worked
of time,
for 3,
yeah.
Yeah.
And some of these records you used were private, things that were kept in the family for years and years, and they didn't have a problem with you using any
It was
of
the one
this
reason why I was appointed historian to the whole council.
I see.
You know, I mean, I don't get requests from a group of individuals within a group of people at any given time to do anything, but I am the officially appointed historical genealogist and historiographer through the council to each of these families, and because of that, to their chivalric orders and offshoots. So what I have is a right of access that comes with any right that any employee of any company, I suppose, would have. There's no point in making you a hospital administrator and shutting up all the cabinets to hold the records and they're going to help you do your job. And it's exactly that, you know, the information is there, the right's there. So, yes, in doing my job for them, I created a book for us.
Thank you.
I was reading your book today at lunch, but I had to stop because I got to page 274 and it's blank. Just before that, you were talking about the tables of testimony that the Templars found in the Temple of Solomon and presumably took with them to France or back to Scotland. I was kind of curious about that. I just finished reading Graham Hancock's book, The Sign and the Seal, where he makes a real convincing argument that they took the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia.
Yep.
So I was wondering if you could comment on Graham Hancock's work and also tell me where the tables of testimony are today.
Tables of testimony, precisely what we're told went into the Ark of the Covenant. 10 Commandments, forget it, read what it says. Who wrote and inscribed the 10 Commandments? God, says MGM. The Bible says that God said to Moses, listen here, I'm going to tell you something and write this down. So Moses wrote it, but God also said, and I will give you tables of testimony, which you must put in that ark. There is nothing secret about 10 Commandments that we've all known for centuries. Why on earth should they be locked away and sought after and protected by knightly orders and Levite priests? We know what they say. They're rules of basic conduct for life, and at best, if we found them, we'd have a great archaeological artifact, but that's all we'd have. Tables of testimony, the tablets of cosmic law. Here is something very different. Where are they today? Oh, Graham Hancock. Yes, let's deal with Graham Hancock. That's an interesting one because it's actually a very good book, and I like Graham a lot, and he does some good work. But Graham Hancock fell foul of the word Ethiopia. The word Ethiopia is actually even used in Genesis. But Ethiopia never existed in the time of Genesis, and not for a great, great, great long time afterwards. The country that eventually became called Ethiopia was Abyssinia. So at any time prior to the name change, which was centuries in, what and where was Ethiopia? Ethiopia was one of those words that was used, not as a place name, but as a word, much like words like Avalon have come to be used within Celtic law. It was the place of the unknown, or the place that we're going to call Ethiopia, but are not prepared to tell you where we really mean. It was not a place. It was an excuse for naming a place that didn't have a name, or the name wasn't to be divulged. The tables of testimony went with the Ark of the Covenant to Scotland. That is where I shall stop my answer.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm wondering if you could comment on the historical significance, if any, of Joan of Arc within the context of the Bloodline and the Holy Grail.
Yeah, that's interesting. Joan of Arc. Burned as a sorceress because she refused to submit to rape by churchmen. Joan of Arc, history tells us, approached the court at Chinon to claim that she had received a vision, a word, a command to lead the French armies to besiege the English fortress at Orleans. And she, the great shepherdess army leader, could defeat the English, who in fact had governed France for some time before that. Yes, she did it, and yes, she succeeded, but there is no way outside of legend that she was any more than a catalyst and the conveyor of a brilliant idea. She was actually granted the whole of the Scots gendarmes. She had armies controlled by 7 major captains of the French forces, and she had the great armies of René d'Anjou, the King of Anjou, who some say was probably her lover, but he was certainly very close to her. René d'Anjou at that time was the helmsman of the Priory of Sion. And the Priory of Sion at that time was deeply integrated with Scotland and the Sinclairs, who had been to America, and the families were all totally related. Joan of Arc's family was related to René d'Anjou's family, who was related to the Sinclairs, who were related to the Kings of Scots, who were related to Columbus. So the whole thing was a mishmash of the same people coming out of the same melting pot, appearing in a specific period of time, doing amazing things that have gone into history, defeating the English, discovering America, whatever it may be, but all actually out of the melting pot. And this is a melting pot which actually are the allies and the immediate adherents, yes, of the Bloodline. And her ambition was to put the House of Valois back on the French throne, and she succeeded. So, great lady, but then after all of that, she's suddenly a witch. But what we learn in our history books is that the person who condemned her as a witch was the Archbishop of Bordeaux. What few people actually do is to check to see who the Archbishop of Bordeaux was at that time. And the Archbishop of the Bordeaux was one of the remnants of the English Empire, and he was actually the Duke of Bedford from England who had held the position. So in actual fact, it wasn't beyond the bounds of anybody's belief to conceive that this guy would find a jolly good way to get rid of Joan of Arc. Okay.
I was curious, there's a lot of speculation and stories about the Rennes Chateau mystery and Saunier Béranger. And I was curious if you uncovered anything new concerning that.
Rennes-le-Château has been a mystery in the public domain, I suppose, to our general knowledge ever since Henry Lincoln brought it to our attention some few years ago, and from that time David Wood and others have sort of joined the crew, and we've had Andrews and Schellenberger recently with their book The Tomb of God. What they each do in their turn is to pursue various lines of geometry and various calculations which lead them to actually the same conclusion. At the end of their books, the same thing is said, and what they say is, wow, there is something very important here. Well, actually, that was said a few hundred years before and doesn't demand a book and a lot of calculations now, because the Knights Templars, every time one comes up, say to me, or certainly the Roslyn Chapel people in Scotland, they say, well, you know, let them do it. They can carry on all the time. When it is decided that what is so important about that this place is destined for release, we will release it. Until then, we're not going to agree or disagree. We'll let them get on with it. So my answer is what their answer should be. I am personally, at this moment in time, quite unqualified to say what is so damned important about that place. Yes, it's important. When I have an answer, I'll write a book. I will not write books that end up with a jolly good idea that might or might not be, and are selling the public a detective story with me as the star cast that actually doesn't find the culprit.
Great, thanks.
Well, they've moved the microphone, and I guess that probably winds it up. I think it's still today, I'm not really sure. Thank you ever so much, all of you. I've had a whale of a time. I'm glad to see that you're still awake and that you're smiling, so life's good. I am enormously privileged to have been here, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very pleased. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye-bye.